Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes. The Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes are pivotal to understanding the regional dynamics of the oil-rich triad of Suriname, Guyana, and Venezuela. As these territorial conflicts, rooted in historical claims and exacerbated by recent geopolitical and economic developments, demand a detailed examination of their legal, diplomatic, and economic ramifications. The May 25, 2025 parliamentary elections in Venezuela will influence the trajectory of these disputes and their resolution. Central to this analysis is the 1966 Geneva Agreement, particularly Article 5, Section 2, which Venezuela interprets as prohibiting Guyana from asserting sovereignty over Guayana Esequiba, including oil exploration in the Stabroek block, until a final resolution is reached. Additionally, the potential military implications of the International Court of Justice decision on the 1899 award introduce a critical dimension, drawing parallels to Russia's actions in Ukraine. The historical documents, maps, and colonial records supporting both nations' claims further complicate the legal landscape, with extensive evidence on both sides. The Guayana Esequiba dispute, spanning 159,500 square kilometers, is a long-standing territorial conflict between Venezuela and Guyana, with significant implications for oil exploitation rights and regional stability. The dispute centers on the validity of the 1899 Paris Arbitral Award, which delimited the boundary between the two nations. Guyana, in its 2018 case before the International Court of Justice, argues that the award is final and binding, supported by historical documents and the 1966 Geneva Agreement, which it claims Venezuela violated by not recognizing the award. Venezuela, however, contends that the 1899 award was null and void due to alleged fraud and error, asserting historical rights over Guayana Esequiba based on colonial documents and the 1777 Treaty of El Pardo, according to Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Venezuela's rejection of the International Court of Justice 2023 ruling, which prohibited elections in the region, further complicates the legal landscape, as it refuses to recognize the court's jurisdiction. Guyana's legal stance is grounded in the principle of res judicata, arguing that the 1899 arbitral award is a settled matter under international law. The award, issued by a tribunal in Paris, delimited the boundary based on extensive historical documents, maps, and colonial records. Key supporting evidence includes 1899 Paris Arbitral Award and 1966 Geneva Agreement. 1899 Arbitral Award is the most significant document supporting Guyana's claim, establishing the boundary line that Guyana argues is final and binding. The tribunal reviewed evidence, including maps by Robert Herman Schomburg from the 1830s and 1840s, which depicted the territory west of the Essequibo River as part of British Guyana. These maps, endorsed by the British government, form the basis of Guyana's assertion that the territory was under British control before the award. Additional colonial records, such as administrative documents and correspondence, detail British governance, tax collection, and resource exploitation, further supporting Guyana's claim. While Venezuela interprets this agreement differently, Guyana sees the 1966 Geneva Agreement as a reaffirmation of the 1899 award, not a rejection. The agreement, signed to resolve the dispute amicably, is supported by historical records that show British Guyana's continuous administration of the territory, including infrastructure development and resource management, according to United Nations Treaty Series 1966. Guyana argues that these activities, documented in colonial archives, demonstrate effective control and sovereignty. Post-independence records, including electoral rolls, census data, and infrastructure projects in Guayana Esequiba, further reinforce Guyana's claim, showing its administration of regions like Barima-Waini and Upper Takutu Upper Essequibo. Venezuela, conversely, leverages historical narratives of colonial injustice, asserting that the 1899 award was marred by British influence and procedural irregularities. The supporting historical documents, maps, and colonial records include 1777 Treaty of El Pardo and 1966 Geneva Agreement. Venezuela cites 1777 Treaty of El Pardo as evidence of Spanish sovereignty over the territory west of the Essequibo River. The treaty, signed between Spain and Portugal, is interpreted by Venezuela as recognizing Spanish control, which Venezuela inherited upon independence in 1830. Venezuelan historical narratives assert that this treaty, along with subsequent Spanish colonial records, establishes a continuous claim to Guayana Esequiba, according to Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Spanish colonial maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries, such as those by Alejandro de Humboldt and Francisco de Miranda, depict the territory as part of Spanish Guyana, with records of Spanish exploration, mission establishments, and resource exploitation. Venezuela argues that these maps and records demonstrate effective Spanish control, which was not relinquished before the 1899 award. Venezuela interprets the 1966 Geneva Agreement as an opportunity to revisit the 1899 award, not as a reaffirmation of it. Article 5, Section 2 is particularly significant, stating, "No acts or activities taking place while this agreement is in force shall constitute a basis for asserting, supporting, or denying a claim to territorial sovereignty in the territories of Venezuela or British Guyana, or create any rights of sovereignty in those territories, except insofar as such acts or activities result from any agreement reached by the Mixed Commission and accepted in writing by the government of Guyana and the government of Venezuela. No new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty in those territories shall be asserted while this agreement is in force, nor shall any claim whatsoever be asserted otherwise than in the mixed commissions while that commission is in being." The source is United Nations Treaty Series 1966. Venezuela argues that this article prohibits Guyana from conducting oil exploration in the Stabroek Block, as such activities constitute an assertion of sovereignty not recognized under the agreement. Venezuelan historical records, including those from the Mixed Commission, support this interpretation, showing no final agreement was reached on sovereignty. The 1962 rejection of the 1899 Paris Arbitral Award by Venezuela, formalized in a decree, is supported by historical documents that assert continuous Venezuelan interest in the territory, despite British and later Guyanese administration. After Venezuela's independence, records of its claims to Guayana Esequiba, including diplomatic correspondence and public statements, reinforce its position. Venezuelan maps and educational materials consistently include Guayana Esequiba as part of its territory, further supporting its claim. The 2023 referendum rejecting the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction is backed by historical documents that assert Venezuela's right to revisit the boundary, particularly in light of alleged fraud in the 1899 award. The contention over these historical documents, maps, and colonial records underscores the complexity of the dispute. Guyana's reliance on the 1899 arbitral award and British colonial evidence is challenged by Venezuela's assertion that the award was illegitimate due to fraud and British influence. Venezuela's colonial maps and records are dismissed by Guyana as outdated or inaccurate, particularly in light of the 1899 tribunal's findings. The 1966 Geneva Agreement, while a common reference, is interpreted differently, with Guyana seeing it as a procedural step and Venezuela as a suspension of sovereignty claims under Article 5, Section 2. The International Court of Justice 2023 ruling rejecting Venezuela's challenge to its jurisdiction relied heavily on the 1899 award and subsequent historical evidence, but Venezuela's refusal to recognize this decision complicates the legal landscape. Latin American countries have responded to the dispute with a mix of concern and caution. Brazil, as a regional power, has offered mediation, with President Lula da Silva calling for dialogue to prevent escalation. Brazil's position reflects its strategic interest in regional stability, given its borders with both nations and its role in the Amazon basin's environmental concerns. Colombia, under President Gustavo Petro, has expressed support for Guyana's sovereignty while urging peaceful resolution, reflecting its balancing act given its borders with both nations. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, issued a statement advocating for a negotiated solution, but its effectiveness is limited by internal divisions. CELAC's role as a mediator is complicated by the lack of consensus among its members, with some supporting Venezuela's historical claims and others backing Guyana's legal position. The Organization of American States, historically involved, is no longer recognized by Venezuela, making CELAC a more viable option for mediation. Other countries like Mexico and Argentina have called for restraint, but their influence is limited by domestic priorities and the broader geopolitical context. Mediation efforts could involve facilitating talks between Venezuela and Guyana, potentially under the auspices of CELAC or with the involvement of neutral third parties like Brazil. However, the political will of both nations, influenced by external actors like China, Russia, and the United States, remains a significant barrier. China's indirect support for Venezuela through economic investments and the United States' backing of Guyana through military and diplomatic support complicate mediation efforts. Venezuela's interpretation of Article 5, Section 2 of 1966 Geneva Agreement challenges the legitimacy of Guyana's oil exploration activities, potentially influencing the stance of mediating countries. The long-term diplomatic consequences of the Guayana Esequiba dispute are profound, particularly concerning oil exploitation rights and the potential for military escalation. If the International Court of Justice upholds the 1899 award of sovereignty over Guayana Esequiba, including the Stabroek Bloc, to the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, potentially increased investment from Western companies like ExxonMobil would be expected to strain Venezuela's economy further. This scenario would solidify Guyana's position as a major oil producer, with implications for its economic growth and regional influence. Conversely, if Venezuela's claims are recognized, it could access these reserves, bolstering its economy but isolating it internationally due to perceived aggression. Venezuela's access to Guayana Esequiba's oil would provide a critical lifeline amidst its economic crisis, but it would likely face sanctions and diplomatic isolation from Western nations, further entrenching its reliance on China and Russia. However, the confirmation of Guyana's sovereignty by the International Court of Justice could also increase the probability of Venezuela militarily intending to take control of Guayana Esequiba, in a manner similar to Russia's actions in Ukraine. These parallels are drawn from Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and the subsequent conflict in eastern Ukraine, where military intervention was justified by historical claims and perceived threats to national security. In Venezuela's case, the loss of oil-rich Guayana Esequiba could be seen as an existential threat to its economy, particularly amidst the Chevron exit and the impending loss of 15,000 oil jobs. The Venezuelan government, facing domestic pressure and international isolation, might consider military action as a desperate measure to reclaim the territory, especially if the International Court of Justice's decision is perceived as illegitimate due to Venezuela's rejection of its jurisdiction. Recent military buildups, supported by Russia and China, and Venezuela's 2023 referendum rejecting International Court of Justice jurisdiction, suggest a potential for escalation. The United States' support for Guyana, through military and diplomatic backing, could further provoke Venezuela, drawing comparisons to NATO's role in Ukraine, where Western support was seen as a catalyst for Russian intervention. The dispute could also affect regional stability, with long-term consequences for Latin American integration and United States influence. China and Russia might exploit divisions to expand their presence, with China potentially investing in Venezuelan oil infrastructure and Russia providing political and military support. The United States, through its support for Guyana, aims to counter this influence, but the Chevron exit creates opportunities for other players. Exploitation in Guayana Esequiba, particularly in the Amazon basin, adds urgency, with indigenous groups like the Warao and Arawak demanding inclusion in decision-making processes. The potential for joint oil exploitation models, like the Norway-Russia-Barents Sea Agreement, offers a pathway to economic cooperation, but requires significant trust building and political will, as quoted by Norwegian Petroleum. Venezuela's interpretation of Article 5, Section 2 of the Geneva Agreement complicates these models, as it requires bilateral agreement for any oil exploitation by Guyana until a final agreement is reached, potentially delaying joint ventures. The Tigri dispute, though less publicized than Guayana Esequiba, remains a concern for Suriname and Guyana, with implications for regional stability and resource management. The area, covering approximately 15,600 square kilometers, is annexed by Guyana, but Suriname seeks recognition of its claims, driven by the rich resources and strategic location near the Corentyne River. Historical claims date back to colonial times, with both nations asserting sovereignty based on different interpretations of colonial boundaries. The dispute is complicated by the presence of valuable resources, including gold, biodiversity, other minerals, and water resources, each presenting unique challenges and opportunities. The Tigri area is rich in gold deposits, which have been a significant factor in the economic interest of both Guyana and Suriname. Gold mining activities, though limited due to the dispute, have been reported in the region, with Guyana administering mining operations since its annexation in the 1960s. The economic potential of gold is substantial, with historical records indicating small-scale mining and recent interest in larger-scale exploitation, as quoted by the Habari Network. The dispute over sovereignty has restricted full-scale development, but the presence of gold remains a key driver of economic and strategic interest. The administration of mining operations by Guyana, despite Suriname's claims, has led to tensions, with both nations seeking to secure access to these valuable reserves. The Tigri area is part of the Amazon rainforest ecosystem, hosting a diverse range of flora and fauna. This biodiversity is a critical resource with potential for ecotourism and conservation efforts. The region is home to numerous endemic species, including rare orchids, exotic birds, and mammals like the jaguar and giant otter. The ecological significance of the area complicates resource exploitation, as environmental concerns must be balanced against economic interests. Conservation efforts, supported by international organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, advocate for sustainable management to preserve this biodiversity. Indigenous communities such as the Tirillo tribe populate their traditional lands. Their livelihoods are intertwined with the ecosystem. Dispute over sovereignty hinders coordinated conservation strategies, potentially threatening the region's environmental integrity. Besides gold, the region may contain other minerals such as bauxite and manganese, though these are less documented compared to gold. The geological composition of the Tigri area suggests potential for additional mineral resources, including limestone and mica, which could support industrial development. However, extensive exploration has been hindered by the territorial dispute, limiting the availability of detailed geological surveys. The presence of these minerals, while not as economically dominant as gold, adds to the strategic importance of the area. The lack of comprehensive data due to the dispute poses challenges for both nations in assessing the full resource potential, but it also presents opportunities for future economic cooperation if sovereignty issues are resolved. The Tigri area includes parts of the New River and other waterways, which are vital for the region's ecosystem and potential hydroelectric development. These water resources support a rich aquatic biodiversity and are crucial for the livelihoods of indigenous communities. The potential for hydroelectric power, particularly in the context of regional energy demands, is significant. but development is constrained by the dispute. The new river flowing through the disputed territory is a critical component of the regional hydrological system, influencing climate regulation and water supply. The strategic importance of these water resources is heightened by the broader context of climate change and the need for sustainable energy solutions, but the lack of agreement on sovereignty complicates infrastructure projects. Suriname's legal arguments are rooted in historical maps and colonial treaties, asserting that Tigri was part of its territory before Guyana's annexation in the 1960s. The government's strategy, outlined in recent policy documents from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, emphasizes diplomatic engagement. Guyana, conversely, cites its administration of the area since the 1960s and the lack of international recognition of Suriname's claims. The dispute has been relatively dormant, but recent oil discoveries in surrounding areas have reignited interest, with both nations seeking to secure their positions. The Tigri dispute resolution is crucial for regional stability, particularly as Suriname's oil sector develops. The government's focus on sustainable development, as outlined in recent policy documents from the Ministry of Natural Resources, aims to mitigate environmental and social challenges, but the influx of Venezuelan migrants strains resources. Guyana's strategic interests amidst the Chevron crisis necessitate continued engagement, with CELAC's role critical amidst the elections. The potential for economic cooperation, with oil revenues shared, could stabilize the region, but political tensions persist, particularly in the context of the Guayana Esequiba dispute. The Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes are interconnected, with resolutions in one potentially influencing the other. Venezuela's historical claims over Guayana Esequiba, if recognized, could embolden Suriname's position in the Tigri dispute, as both nations share a narrative of colonial injustice. Conversely, Guyana's success in affirming its sovereignty over Guayana Esequiba could strengthen its position in Tigri, complicating Suriname's claims. Environmental concerns with oil exploitation threatening the Amazon basin add urgency, with indigenous groups like the Warao and Arawak demanding inclusion. Policy recommendations for resolving these disputes include enhancing diplomatic engagement through CELAC, leveraging historical archives to build trust, and involving non-state actors in negotiation processes. Joint oil exploitation models like the Norway-Russia-Barents Sea Agreement offer a pathway to economic cooperation, but require significant political will. The May 25, 2025 Guayana Esequiba elections present a critical juncture, with potential for either escalation or dialogue, necessitating a coordinated regional approach. We will now explore humanitarian response to Venezuela's migration crisis, a critical component of regional stability, particularly as it intersects with the Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes. The crisis has displaced over 7.9 million Venezuelans, with significant implications for host countries like Colombia, Guyana, and Suriname. International and regional efforts, led by organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and the International Organization for Migration, IOM, aim to address the needs of these migrants, but face challenges from political tensions, xenophobia, and local perceptions. The United Nations High Commissioner for Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan is a cornerstone of the international response, seeking $1.5 billion to support 5.4 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees across Latin America and the Caribbean. Launched in 2020 and updated annually, the RMRP Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan aims to provide life-saving assistance, protection, and integration support, with funding requests increasing due to escalating crisis. The plan coordinates efforts among multiple stakeholders, including governments, non-government organizations, and international organizations, to address the multifaceted needs of migrants, from shelter and healthcare to legal status and employment opportunities. However, the scale of the crisis, with migrants spread across 17 countries, challenges the path's effectiveness, particularly as political instability in Venezuela persists. The International Organization for Migrations complements United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees efforts through job initiatives in key host countries like Colombia, Guyana, and Peru. These initiatives focus on integrating Venezuelan migrants into labor markets, providing vocational training, and facilitating access to formal employment. However, recent reports indicate a 30% increase in anti-migrant sentiment in Guyana, driven by perceptions that migrants strain social services and compete for jobs. In Colombia, the Estatuto Temporal de Protección, or Temporary Protection Statute, supported by the European Union, has provided legal status to over 2 million Venezuelans, enabling access to health care, education, and work permits. Despite its success, the program faces sustainability challenges due to shifting political stances under President Gustavo Petro, who has prioritized regional cooperation but also navigates domestic pressures. The European Union's broader engagement through funding and policy alignment aims to support these initiatives, but political tensions, such as Venezuela's non-recognition of the Organization of American States, limit coordination. Latin American responses, coordinated through mechanisms like the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, seek regional solutions to the migration crisis. Mercosur's initiatives, such as labor mobility agreements, aim to facilitate migrant integration, but Venezuela's suspension from the bloc since 2017 complicates these efforts. CELAC, despite its broader membership, faces internal divisions, with some members supporting Venezuela's historical claims and others backing international legal processes. The lack of consensus hinders effective regional responses. Within the region, perceptions of humanitarian aid often view it as exploitable by immigrants, urging migration to access these systems, similar to patterns observed in the United States and Europe. Local media narratives prevalent in countries like Venezuela and Suriname suggest that international sanctions justify immigration, preventing locals from benefiting from aid. This narrative fuels xenophobia, particularly in Guyana, where complaints about immigration strain social services and exacerbate tensions with Venezuelan migrants, as reported by Demerara Waves. In Suriname, the government's response, aiming to integrate migrants but facing capacity limits, mirrors Guyana's challenges, with policies like temporary work permits struggling to address the scale of the crisis. The demographics of migrants, with a significant portion aged 18 through 35 and skilled in various sectors, indicate a potential loss of human capital affecting regional development. The United States plays a complex role in coordinating a regional response, offering opportunities for collaboration despite border policy conflicts. United States support for Guyana through military and diplomatic backing, aims to counter the influence of China and Russia. But the Chevron exit creates opportunities for other players, such as Indian companies like Oil and Natural Gas Corporation Videsh Limited, ONGC Videsh. The European External Action Service highlights potential for United States coordination with CELAC, particularly in funding and policy alignment, despite Venezuela's non-recognition of the Organization of American States. However, United States border policies, such as restrictions on asylum seekers, limit its direct engagement with the migration crisis, complicating regional efforts. The tension between international aid efforts and local sentiments influences regional dynamics, particularly in the context of the Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes. The influx of Venezuelan migrants into Suriname and Guyana strains resources, exacerbating existing territorial and economic tensions. The humanitarian response, therefore, must navigate these complexities, balancing immediate needs with long-term regional stability. Humanitarian response to Venezuela's migration crisis is a critical factor in the broader regional context. International initiatives like the United Nations Higher Commissioner for Refugees, Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan, and International Organization for Migration's job programs, alongside regional efforts through Mercosur and CELAC, aim to address the crisis, but face significant challenges from xenophobia, political tensions, and local perceptions. The United States' role, despite its limitations, offers opportunities for collaboration, particularly with CELAC. Migration and its impact on regional stability needs a coordinated and inclusive approach. Looking ahead, the future of the oil-rich triad of Suriname, Guyana, and Venezuela depends on resolving disputes, stabilizing economies, and addressing humanitarian challenges. In Venezuela, the maximum pressure policies of the United States might benefit oil deals with Russia and China. The government strategy outlined in recent policy documents from the Ministry of Petroleum emphasizes diversification and international cooperation, but challenges persist. In Suriname, stabilizing the nascent oil industry amidst political risks, particularly in the context of the Tigri dispute, requires diplomatic engagement and sustainable development. The government's strategy, outlined in recent policy documents from the Ministry of Natural Resources, focuses on balancing economic growth with environmental protection. But the influx of Venezuelan migrants strains resources, as reported by the Jamaica Observer. Policy recommendations include enhancing regional cooperation, particularly with Guyana, and leveraging Belt and Road Initiative investments for infrastructure development. Guyana anticipates economic growth tempered by migration and territorial disputes, necessitating a balanced approach to oil exploration and social integration. The government's strategy, outlined in recent policy documents from the Ministry of Natural Resources, emphasizes local content and indigenous inclusion, but challenges persist, particularly in the context of the Guayana Esequiba dispute. Policy recommendations include strengthening legal frameworks, enhancing diplomatic engagement with Venezuela and Suriname, and addressing humanitarian needs. The interplay of these dynamics across the oil-rich triad highlights the need for a coordinated approach with implications for regional stability and international relations. Future prospects depend on resolving disputes, stabilizing economies, and addressing humanitarian challenges, necessitating a triad-focused strategy. The Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes, alongside Venezuela's migration crisis, represent a nexus of legal, diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian challenges that define the regional dynamics of the oil-rich triad of Suriname, Guyana, and Venezuela. These issues are deeply intertwined, with historical claims, resource wealth, and migration pressures shaping the stability and development of Latin America. The 1966 Geneva Agreement, particularly Article 5, Section 2, remains a contentious point, requiring bilateral agreement for any resource exploitation by Guyana until a final resolution, complicating economic cooperation. The potential for military escalation if the International Court of Justice upholds the 1899 award draws parallels to Russia's actions in Ukraine, underscoring the risks of geopolitical tension. Simultaneously, the humanitarian response to Venezuela's migration crisis, displacing over 7.9 million people, strains host countries and exacerbates regional dynamics. The analysis reveals that resolution requires a multifaceted approach. Legally, the historical documents, maps, and colonial records supporting both Guyana's and Venezuela's claims must be leveraged to build trust, with International Court of Justice's decision on the 1899 award being a pivotal moment. Diplomatically, enhancing engagement through the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and neutral third parties like Brazil is essential. Despite internal divisions and Venezuela's non-recognition of the Organization of American States (OAS. Economically, joint exploitation models such as the Norway-Russia-Barents Sea Agreement offer pathways to cooperation, but Venezuela's interpretation of Article 5, Section 2 delays these ventures. Environmentally, the Amazon basin's integrity must be prioritized, with indigenous groups like the Warao, Arawak, and Tirillo demanding inclusion in decision-making processes. Humanitarily, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and International Organization for Migration (IOM) initiatives alongside regional efforts through Mercosur and CELAC must navigate xenophobia and local perceptions to support 5.4 million migrants effectively. Interconnectedness of these issues, legal sovereignty, economic resources, environmental sustainability, and humanitarian response necessitates a coordinated regional approach. The United States' support for Guyana amidst the Chevron's exit and the influence of China and Russia further complicate the landscape, but opportunities for collaboration with CELAC exist. Future of the Guayana Esequiba and Tigri disputes, with the humanitarian response to Venezuela's migration crisis, will shape Latin America's stability and development. A resolution that balances historical claims, resource management, environmental concerns, and migrant integration is imperative. The path forward requires significant trust-building, political will, and inclusive policies. The stakes are high, not only for the nations involved, but for the broader region, demanding a concerted effort to ensure peace, prosperity, and sustainability.